So, an audiobook, The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist, a true story of injustice in the American South by Radley, Balko and Tucker Carrington. I listened to this on audio. It was very ably narrated by Robert Fass, who did an amazing job. It took me a long time to listen to. It's not an easy book to listen to by any stretch of the imagination. It's harsh. So, where to start with this one? Let's start with the fact that it wasn't what I expected. What I was expecting was a book about forensics, Cadaver King, country dentist, and because I listened to this on audio, basically I opened the library app, I wanted a non-fiction, I found this, and the forensic link sounded good because I have worked in pathology, interested in forensics. It sounded good. Not what I expected at all. There's actually remarkably little forensic detail. What this is largely is an expose of two individuals, one called Hayne, who is the Cadaver King, and one called West, who is the country dentist. And it is, well, there's not a lot of forensics because essentially neither of them had the qualifications they claimed. And this is where this true horror becomes real horror. It's like, forget the horror of a puppet picking up a pair of scissors and chasing you around the house, or a clown coming out of the drains. That's imaginary horror. This is real horror. Right in your face. And can I just say, as a non-American, no criticism. There's no justice system in the world that is perfect, and they all have their own flaws. But I am grateful as hell that I am not an impoverished black woman living in Mississippi. And a lot of the early part of this book goes a long way to describing or helping someone like me understand the extremely toxic state of racial tensions in America. Anyway, Hayne and West. So for about 2 decades, Dr. Stephen Hayne, but was he really a doctor? It doesn't sound like it. And Dr. Michael West, who at least was a dentist and had a practice. Yes, so for 2 decades, they essentially took over completely, I'm going to say, the Mississippi area. They did most of the pathology. And can I just say, based entirely on this book, they weren't very good at it. They did a lot of it, but they weren't very good at it. Let's start with Hayne. He used to testify in court and claim that he was a member of a certain board, but that board wasn't actually forensic pathology. It was some other board, and the jury couldn't be expected to know that, and the judges allowed him to do that for 2 decades. Now, this book was written in the wake of something called the Innocence Project, if I understand it correctly, starting to manage to get out of jail some of the people that Hayne had wrongly convicted. And I don't know that all of this sounds reasonable. To me, it didn't sound reasonable, but the amount of research that has gone into it by Radley Balko, who I believe is a very experienced investigative journalist, explains how it all happens. And that's what makes this harsh reading. Because in order to explain how someone could, for 2 decades, go into court and tell juries things that were manifestly not true, in order to understand how that could happen, you have to go back to the history of the justice system in the southern states of America. And it's hard for me to construct all of this because it gives you, the first part of the book I nearly did not finish because it had to give you so much history, and it's American history, and I'm not that interested in American history. I'll read some of it, certainly in terms of criminology and forensics and stuff. But when he starts going into the state of Mississippi and all the different, what are they, counties, I think? There seem to be hundreds of them, and I've never heard of any of them, and I don't understand any of it, and I don't remember it. I'm not going to remember it. I've never been to Mississippi. I probably never will. So knowing the names of all these counties and how far they are from each other, it works in building up the story, but it doesn't work in my head. He has to go back further. He has to go back to the fact that the American justice system, like most of the justice systems in the Commonwealth, essentially came out of witch burning in England, which is the basis for the justice system in all the colonies that were colonized by England, Royal Britannica, ours as well. And I knew that. Then Mississippi justice system has got some things that seem quite unique and individualistic. I gather they're not that individual in America, but they would be for here. So it sounds like, and if any American watches this, by all means tell me I'm wrong, because I'm not sure that I get it. It sounds like your public prosecutors and your judges are elected by the public, and that in order to be re-elected, they have to basically be a politician who stands up there and convinces people to vote for them. The very fact that a modern country has that as a justice system should be of significant concern, I think. The whole idea of a judge being able to direct a jury on conviction should mean that that judge is impartial. But the way this Mississippi structure seems to be is the judge can't be impartial because he won't be re-elected if he's seen to be doing things that the majority of people don't want. And this is in a state that is notorious worldwide, even I've heard of them, of the Jim Crow era. And I don't understand exactly what Jim Crow is, but it seems to be associated with the Ku Klux Klan and the fact that for many years, and much more recently than I thought, murdering black people in Mississippi was just fine, and was usually done by the very police and justice system who are meant to be defending citizens. Some of the stories in here are truly nauseating and absolutely unbelievable. It's like, even after slavery was abolished, citizens who signed up to vote could expect to be persecuted and murdered. And the people who murdered them got away scot-free for the most part. So the actual injustices that Americans of African descent experienced in that county, it was beyond, I knew it was bad. It was beyond anything that I had read about before. It was absolutely nauseating. And so recent. I can't remember the last date a black American was tortured to death horribly in Mississippi with no one even bothering to investigate it. But it was recent. It was really recent. In my lifetime anyway. That's unbelievable. Okay, so you came from that system. And the judges were elected by the people, but the judges were being elected by the same people who were murdering anyone who was poor or black or not one of the good old boys. Problems? Sure, there's heaps. And they persisted right up until the late 2000s. How good is that? Okay, so this particular book goes into the manifestation of Stephen Hayne. Now, Stephen Hayne built a successful career as I hesitate to say professional in forensics, but that's what he represented himself as being. Despite a lack of qualifications and a lack of board certifications, he had those things on his CV and claimed them. He had a huge list of publications, but many of those publications seemed like they weren't much more than advertisements for his services in police journals. Now, the reason he got so much work is because of this unique structure in Mississippi. It's like basically for many years, if you wanted to get elected, you needed to be tough on crime. And they're also one of those states who love killing their citizens, so you've got a death row. And it sounds like for many years into the 90s, you were unlikely to get elected unless you were tough on crime and you really wanted to send people to death row. Okay. Not my country, not my circus, not my monkeys. I don't even have any monkeys or a circus in this one. I think the death penalty has got major issues, but it's not my country. So, yes. Now, regarding Stephen Hayne, when we finally got around to the things he was doing, it was later in the book, and I was already a bit topped up on Americanisms. But for many of the years when he practiced at his height, which started in the 80s and kept going, I think it was in 2010 that he stopped being called upon. He was doing autopsies for the state, and he was testifying in court, and he was also employed by, I think it was a renal research laboratory, and by a hospital. Both of those two full-time positions came with a salary of about $100,000 a year, I think it was, and that's American, so that's closer to $200,000 a year for Australians. Both of those were full-time positions, and he did all the others. Now, every country has a guideline on how many autopsies a forensic pathologist can do. Long into Hayne's career, another forensic pathologist was criticised for having done 300 odd autopsies a year, which was too much. Hayne was doing thousands, as well as testifying in court. In chapter 13, the author talks about one particular day in which he testified in 4 different courts in 4 different places around Mississippi, and I think a couple of them were 100 kilometers, a couple of 100 kilometers or miles away from each other, and then also did, count them, 9 autopsies in one day. So, as the author states, no wonder with this type of workload that Hayne was making some mistakes. 2 of the noteworthy ones that he mentioned is one autopsy where he describes a victim's uterus and ovaries as being of normal appearance. Problem was, the victim in question was a male and hence had no ovaries and no uterus, but rather a testes, etc. Big problem. Another one, you had a prisoner who died of sepsis, and when Hayne did his autopsy, he described the spleen as being of normal weight and normal appearance with an intact capsule. I don't think they use the word capsule there, but yes, no. Now, a workload of doing as much as he was doing, you might ignore the fact that the spleen can't possibly have looked normal under sepsis, but he somehow managed to miss the fact that the spleen had been removed from this person 4 or 5 years previously. And how did he manage to practice with these sorts of errors? Well, the prosecutors and the judges wanted him to. So a small error of knowing what gender he's dissecting, or whether their spleen is or is not in the body, those are problems enough one would expect to deregister him, except he wasn't registered to begin with, so you couldn't deregister him, could you? A bigger problem with Hayne, and I haven't even got to West yet, is that, as this book implies, he almost always testified on behalf of the prosecution, and the habit seemed to be for the prosecution to come to Hayne and say, we've got this suspect, we're pretty sure he did it, we've got no evidence, can you whip something up? And he would. And next thing you know, there was all this bogus evidence, like blood splatters on the walls, which had never even been tested to see if they were tea or blood. A huge, huge workload of 2 decades of horror. West was a buddy of Hayne's. He developed the science these days it's considered highly questionable bite mark forensics. But beyond the inherent dubiousness of that as an actual science, one of the practices that was captured on film was taking a mostly cadavers, but in one case a woman in a coma, getting a imprint of the teeth of the person the prosecution suspected was the culprit, because they wanted to, and taking that imprint and repeatedly pushing it into the flesh until there was a mark where there'd never been a mark before, and then going into court and testifying that this mark could only have come from this one person. That's heavily discredited, and apparently not even Dr. Michael West still claims that that's possible. But what makes this truly horrible, this evidence to measure as purchased by prosecution, is that this is a state with a death penalty. And during the time, or just before this book was written, 11 people were released, and I think most of them were in death row. One came within a hair's breadth of being executed after all this false evidence being given to an innocent jury who really isn't required to know better. The judge is meant to pass this, but the judges are elected and know they won't get back into term if they don't. Anyway, this is a book of true horror. And it's true horror because it's real and because it's happened to many of them, to many real people. Kennedy Brewer and Lavon Brooks are two that are specifically mentioned. They were both put on death row for rape and murder of two little girls who were both raped and murdered by a completely different person, and the evidence that Hain and West provided helped put them on death row. Luckily, they both survived execution. Or was Brooks in prison for life? He might have been in prison for life, and it might have been Brewer on death row. One of those things. So yes, truly horrible. Apparently, because they had 2 decades to do this in, there are still plenty of people in America in jail, and the very complicated judge and appeal system of America means that the majority of the people who were put in jail based on this testimony have got no way to appeal whatsoever. That's the last chapter of the book, and it's horror upon horror, really. It's like the whole system seems to know perfectly well that the evidence that was used in their trial was bogus, but there doesn't seem to be any way for them to get around it. So yes, true horror. Forget the clowns, forget the Chuckies. This is horror if you want it for October, Halloween month. I know some people who actually are American and understand the judiciary, they're better. Say it's a good book, but they criticize the fact that the system isn't broken. By all means, tell me why the system isn't broken, because a judge in charge of a courtroom, in charge of people's lives, who knows that he won't be elected unless he does things that the media and the general public are going to approve of. Explain to me how that's not broken, by all means. Horrifying book. Thoroughly recommended to anyone who likes the grotesque. Like, comment, subscribe, all those things that YouTube wants you to do. It looks good on my stats.